Today I want to compare the use of stencils on white, grey and black paper. I will be using Distress Oxides on one hand, and on the other hand, Nuvo Embellishment Mousse. And of course, we are going to make some cards. My name is Julia, I'm an enthusiastic card maker and paper crafter from Austria. Welcome to my channel, Julie's Kreativschatzkiste. So these are the products we are going to use today. This set from Altenew is called Build a Garden Rosa Gallica. It's a great set with 2 great flower stamps and a lot of sentiment. There are 6 layering stencils included in this set, 2 for the smaller of the flower stamps and 4 for the larger one. I started out by stamping both big flower stamps several times. For my white paper I used blue Memento ink. For my grey and my black paper I used Arteza Premium Watercolor paper, which has a slight texture in it and I really liked it. On my black paper I stamped with embossing ink and used white embossing powder. On my grey paper I wanted to try a more subtle effect and I used also embossing ink, but I used transparent embossing powder on it. As you see, it first looks white, but when I heated it, it took the grey color from the background. Then I started the stenciling. The stencils have the numbers engraved in them, and there's also a guide in the packaging that helps you align all the stencils. For my first set of flowers I used the same Distress Oxide colors on the white, grey and black background in order to be able to compare it well. I used dried marigold, wild honey, abandoned coral and vintage photo for the flower. For the leaves of my flowers I used the Distress Oxides Shabby Shutters and Lucky Clover. As you can see, I have already colored in the smaller of the flower stems and I used a piece of mylar, which is the material stencils are made of, to protect it. So this is how the layering stencils with Distress Oxide looks on white paper. I did exactly the same process on the black paper and on the grey paper. When I was done coloring on the stamps and stencils which I heat embossed before, I used a moist piece of tissue paper to tap off the excess ink on the embossing carefully. I do not have the dies for this set, which are of course available as well. So I used my Scan and Cut electronic cutting machine to cut my flowers out. Every time I do that I also cut the same shape out of plain white paper in order to glue it behind my flowers and give them more sturdiness. I did that here as well with the white paper. I did not do it for the black and for the grey paper, as the watercolor paper already was very thick. If you now compare the white, the grey and the black paper and the stenciling on it, you already see that the colors are much more intense on the white paper, but I also really like the more subtle look on the darker paper as well. This is of course the result of the Distress Oxides. You would probably get a very different result using Distress inks, or any other inks for that matter. Which one do you like best? Let me know in the comments. For my second set of flowers, which is a smaller flower stamp, I decided to use a combination between Distress Oxides as well as Embellishment Mousse from Nuvo. Again, I used the same combinations for all of my papers in order to be able to compare it. I started out by coloring the base of the flower in Abandoned Coral. For the base of the leaves, I used Lucky Clover Distress Oxide again. And as I want my stamping ink to be really dry, when I put the Nuvo mousse on top, I heat set that with my heat gun. For the layer with the details on the leaves, I use Nuvo Embellishment Mousse Spring Green. I use a spatula to put some of the mousse on my work surface, and then I just put it with my fingers onto the stencil and the paper. And now the big reveal. What I can already say is that the Distress Oxides looked more intense on white paper. But with the Nuvo Embellishment Mousse it's different because they look really great on the darker papers. And especially this color is really beautiful. One handy thing about embellishment mousse is that you can also heat set that with your heat gun, carefully. For my next layer, which are the first layer of details on the rose, I use Coral Calypso Embellishment Mousse. And after again heat setting that carefully, I use another embellishment mousse, this time Antique Red. And the great thing about embellishment mousses, you can use one on top of the other. You can either put one on top of the other which is dry already, but you can also mix them if you want to. I didn't do that in this case, but it would also look really great, I think. I then used the embellishment also on the small flower blossoms on the side. However, I didn't like that the mousse was then just one real blotch on the paper and there were no contours visible of the flowers. I took my dye pick and I made my own contours in the flowers, as well as some decorative lines. That is actually really easy as long as the embellishment mousse hasn't dried yet. And it looked really good. For the center of the flower, I finally took Indian Gold Embellishment Mousse. And this is how the result with stenciling with Distress Oxides and embellishment mousse on top looks like. I really like the result actually on all the three papers. The colors are so intense and there's a certain shine to this embellishment mousse, which is great to look at. I cut out these flowers as well with my Scan and Cut. I didn't have any problems doing so with this embellishment mousse, but you have to take care that it's really dry when putting it in your cutting machine. And now we're going to make some cards with our flowers. For my first card I used these two stenciled images on white paper. I used a dark blue blank card for this in order to have some contrast in my card, and I used both images and put them together so that they cover the full front of the card. I then added a sentiment, which is also from Altenew in this case, from the German stamps, and then I finished my card by cutting off the overlapping parts of my stenciled images. I do that from the back because that's easier. One of these paper parts I cut off I used to fill in a gap on my front page. I also glued it down and then cut off the remaining overlap. And that's my first cut finished. For the image on my black cardstock with my blended Distress Oxides, I used the black card base, and then I put over it a piece of cream white paper on which I have used this panel die from the Tonic Studios. There are some small cut-out circles in this pattern, which lets the black from the background shine through, so that the card is cohesive with the black stenciled image on top. The stenciled image is my focal point and it fits perfectly on the card front. Then I add my sentiment right onto the flower, which is Alles Gute, all the best, and finished is my card number 2. The construction of my next card is pretty similar to my previous one. I again used a cover plate or piercing die or whatever you like to call it, but this time I didn't use a black card base, but instead I used a black matting layer and I used a cream white blank card, so I have one more layer than the previous card. Again, I add my image as a focal point and then I attach my sentiment. Here you see the two cards side by side. One is more subtle and the other one more intense, but I really like both of them. The stenciled image on the grey cardstock was not really as I imagined it to be, because I didn't really see the lines, the transparent embossed lines, and on the other hand the colors were very light. So I decided to take a silver glitter pencil and just redraw the outlines of the flower in order to get more contrast. I constructed my base card out of a cream white blank card. Then I had a piece of grey paper, the same grey cardstock I used for the stenciling, and on top of that I had a Miro cardstock in rose gold, which I also pierced with my piercing die. The Miro cardstock also helped to set the focus of the card on my stenciled image. And I also used this Miro cardstock in my sentiment, which I added here. As final decoration and for even more contrast, I added black dots onto my card. For my fourth and final card, I used these two images, which have also embellishment mousse on top of them. I decided to play with the white and the grey in the background also on my card base. I cut out 2 panels of the white and the grey cardstock in the same size. And then I used my flowers as a template to see where I could cut them diagonally, to have a grey background for the white stenciled flower and to have a white background for the grey stenciled flower. So I use the upper part in grey and the lower part in white on my white card blank. The other 2 pieces you see here, I cut the smaller because the first ones are just the layering for the second ones, because then I want to change the color again. So on the grey paper piece on my card blank, I will put on top a white pierced paper, and on the white paper I will put a grey pierced paper on top. And then I will add the flowers as focal point. When I did the piercing with the die on the grey and the white paper, I adhered them together with a low adhesive tape, so that the pattern in the piercing die is continuously on both papers. So this is then the completed card with all the matting layer and pierced layers and my focal images as well. In the middle I added a sentiment, which is from the Altenew stamps again. And I also have my drops again. The light drops on the grey cardstock and the black drops on the white cardstock. By the way, also on the first cards we made, I added some drops off screen. So these are my finished cards for today, with the stenciled images on white, grey and black cardstock using Distress Oxides and embellishment mousse. I really like how the cards turned out. I hope you liked them too. Let me know in the comments what you think. Please consider subscribing to my channel if you have not already done so, and I would be really glad if you would leave me a like. See you next time. Servus!